When we talk about investment that meets community needs, we often hear that places like Molokai, where communities are fiercely protecting their cultural and environmental resources, are anti-investment or anti-development. Reframed correctly, we are actually pro-responsible investment when projects are structured to create community ownership and align with our ahupua'a values. We also often hear that we won't be able to find investors with the experience, skills, and creativity to both achieve a reasonable financial return while simultaneously supporting the goals of our communities because investors need to make money. Jason Scott is a principal at Renewable Resource Group and co-chair of the CREO syndicate and has an extensive background in impact and ESG investing. Aloha, Jason. Will you please tell us how investors could build value in an isolated island community with strong cultural traditions such as Molokai?
Sure, I'm happy to. I'm not in an isolated island community. I'm in Brooklyn, New York, so it's very loud right now, as Ian and Shay know from visiting me here. Um, but I'm excited to talk about this, and I appreciate the chance to hear the other presentations first. I think they're great examples of things that investors are actually looking for now. That's quite different from what they've been looking for in the past. I think there's two really, really big trends that if you haven't heard about them or are worth looking into. One is investors looking for investments that are what people are calling now net zero. So from a carbon perspective, so carbon neutral, carbon negative, and I think the energy and energy storage projects that you all are talking about are perfect examples of that. And then I think more broadly on the ESG side, projects that incorporate local ownership, community ownership, and indigenous communities into the design, the development, and the management of those assets are becoming increasingly important as well. If you look at what's happened in the past in things like the carbon and biodiversity markets, if you look at things around sustainable fisheries and other things I think would be quite applicable to Hawaii generally and Molokai specifically, I think there are lots of opportunities for investors to achieve both these goals around net zero, but also around local ownership and governance of assets. And I would say that the opportunities in those areas, the people looking for opportunities in those areas can be described as both kind of large institutional asset owners, so people like pension funds and endowments, some of whom are doing things that are not very good or very responsible, as we know from some of the activities around Maui that you all have written, or that Ian and Shay have written about for sure, and that you all are very aware about, very aware from a governance perspective. But a lot of those long-term investors are looking for assets now that are net zero, ESG compliant, and taking much more seriously some of the governance and environmental considerations. I don't think the Trinitas project would have been able to go forward in kind of this current environment from a governance perspective. So, but there are also, in addition to pensions and endowments, are family offices and large fund managers. So the CREO syndicate, which you mentioned, is a network of family offices. It's about 130 family offices around the world who are interested in sustainable investing. And more of those are writing checks all the way from the size that Stephanie was talking about, kind of on the much smaller size with very innovative structures, grants, concessionary capital, all these kinds of things that the panel's been talking about, but also very mainstream investments seeking commercial return. And I actually do think that some of the projects that you all are describing could achieve commercial returns if people have the right approach. People, meaning investors, have the right approach to local ownership, long-term returns, and other attributes that are aligned more with community ownership and ESG principles. So I think as people start trying to really adhere to those guidelines and start really trying to find assets and opportunities that are aligned with them, I think a lot of the projects that are possible on Molokai and other places in Maui and around Hawaii are incredibly commercial. But some of that is because investors are changing how they define what is commercially viable.
Mahalo, I love that. My second question is, how could a comprehensive transition to sustainability and power, transportation and agriculture within Molokai island geography be financed?
So I think what's exciting about a system like Molokai in a way which is a closed system in a lot of ways, certainly when it comes to things like energy, food, and transport, is that more and more people, people meaning investors again, are looking for opportunities in what we would call sustainable infrastructure. The firm that I work with, Renewable Resource Group, that's what we invest in. We invest mostly in production agriculture and water resources, but we also invested in renewable energy, and we partner with other investment managers who are interested in the same thing. And what's super exciting about Molokai, I think, is that with the natural resources that you have, with the ability to generate power and electricity from solar, with battery storage, with water, with productive agricultural land, the community could theoretically support itself with the right kind of long-term capital that's aligned with local community ownership. And I think that it might not have been possible even 5 or 10 years ago because of how investors would look at something like Molokai and think, well, how do I generate a really quick return? How do I sell this asset to someone else? But if you can create a truly sustainable infrastructure with profitability, but that is very long term and grows at a slow and reasonable and appropriate rate over time, I think you could find capital from mainstream private investors that would support this kind of closed, sustainable system on Molokai. But even better, I think the grants, concessionary capital, other types of structures we've been talking about before are available as well. And the final piece of the puzzle, and this was mentioned on the energy side, is we do now have a supportive federal government when it comes to things like USDA grants and loans, low cost loans for renewables and solar. And even if some of those things were available before, I think with the money that's coming through the various recovery acts, interest in investing in community development, financial institutions, tax credits, grants and loans, I think there's an incredible opportunity to package those types of state and local and federal incentives with commercial capital to build long-term infrastructure that's owned by local communities, that adheres to these ESG standards, and that generates a fair rate of return for investors, not an extractive or what I would say is unfair rate of return to the local owners. So I think it's a really exciting time to be thinking about what you're thinking about, both in terms of what broader capital markets are doing and thinking about, but also in terms of how state, local, and federal governments are thinking about how to support those investments.
Absolutely. It's such great timing. What a difference in federal leadership it can make when leadership believes that climate change is real and investing in our, nation's infrastructure has long-term benefit. My last question for you, Jason, is given some of the negative experiences we've had here in Maui County, can you tell us how the community can provide clear rules of the road and accountability mechanisms to ensure that our values and expectations are met?
That is a very good and very difficult question. And I've heard a lot of the examples that people have mentioned today in terms of indigenous leadership and community ownership. Sometimes it's hard to get that local alignment and local leadership. So if you don't have local alignment and local leadership, then people, again, meaning investors and other um, operators, can exploit that, and I think use that against the community. So I think if there is community alignment, it is very, very powerful to form a partnership with private capital. I do think that whether it's formally through nonprofit associations, through, as we mentioned before, community development financial institutions, whether it's through cooperatives owned by workers, owned by the community, there needs to be a counterparty or an entity that a private investor can negotiate with. And I think if that counterparty has the affirmative consent of the local community, then it's a really exciting partner. I think where it gets difficult is when there's the opportunity to kind of exploit differences in the local community. And I think that's what we've seen in some of the projects um, in other parts of Hawaii, where somehow one was able to pit local community interests against each other. And that's why I think this whole idea of having a sustainable, again, not totally closed, but kind of closed um, investment strategy and community where everything complements each other. So where food and water, where agriculture and energy, where transportation, where they reinforce each other in positive ways, and all the stakeholders are bought in, keeps outside forces from dividing the community. So I think the most important thing is to have some type of entity that private capital can transact with, and then have that entity aligned internally. There will not, you will never have unanimity in any community, but some type of entity where there's like real alignment is, I think, the critical missing part of any partnership with private capital.
Great points. Mahalo, Jason.